With the time now being a little after 10 a.m., I want to call this hearing of the House Committee on Federal Stimulus and Census Oversight to order. Today we just have one bill before us, S-2554, an act to provide for competitiveness and infrastructure investment in Massachusetts. None of us are strangers to hearings, but please be advised that this hearing is live on the legislature's website, and it will be recorded for review by committee members and the public. I'm Jack Patrick Lewis, chair of this committee. To my left is the vice chair, Chris Hendricks. At some point over the next hour or so, with very little notice, I'm going to hand over the chairing of the committee, so be ready for that. Later today, we'll be joined by more members of the committee, but I want to actually invite the members of the committee who are here to introduce themselves at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman. Good morning, everyone. Simon Cataldo for the 14th Middlesex District.
Good morning, I'm Todd Smola, 1st Camden District in Western Massachusetts.
And our ranking minority member of the committee. I know a couple others will be joining us. They're sitting in traffic. The bill before us was filed in October by Governor Healy and amended and passed by the Senate on January 11th. As we're going to hear today from, I believe, only supporters of the bill who have signed up to testify, arguing that we are missing opportunities to capitalize on up to $17 billion in federal funding under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS Act. But because these funding opportunities require matching contributions, this bill would need to be passed, and these conversations are thus moving forward. I'm really grateful to everyone who has submitted testimony to the committee, for folks who have signed up to testify in person today, for those watching live at home as well. While testimony was due officially, I think, yesterday, if there's something that comes up today during the hearing that leaves a question in your mind or that you want to clarify, please just follow up with my staff as soon as possible. I know Mass Taxpayers Foundation was hoping to attend and testify in favor, but were not able to, but they have definitely sent their testimony as well. I think that is all of the housekeeping I need to do today. Excellent. So first up, we have Director Quentin Palfrey and Secretary Gorkowitz. The floor is yours. Thank you so much for coming in.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Lewis and Vice Chairman Hendricks, members of the committee. Before I get started, I just want to make sure we did hand out some materials for your review. Those are a couple of issue briefs that we developed in support of and highlighting some of the provisions of the bill we're about to testify on today. So hopefully that answers many of your questions. It's a pleasure to be here with you today on behalf of the Healy-Driscoll administration to testify in support of Senate 2482, an act to provide for competitiveness and infrastructure investments in Massachusetts. I'm Matthew Gorkowitz, Secretary for Administration and Finance, and I'm here today with Quentin Palfrey, our administration's Director of Federal Funds and Infrastructure. I'd also like to take a moment to thank Treasurer Goldberg's office, who worked closely with us on the development of this legislation. We are incredibly grateful to the Senate, which earlier this year advanced the proposal before you today, now Senate 2552, an amended version of what the administration filed earlier this year. This proposal would create a pool of up to $750 million in new resources derived from interest on the stabilization fund over the next 3 years to put up as matching funds for federal grant applications. But we are also here to tell you why we believe the full legislation filed by Governor Healy in October is not only important but necessary to put Massachusetts in the best position to compete nationally for unprecedented federal funding opportunities and take advantage of the unique economic environment to support our capital program. With over $17 billion in federal grants out there for us to compete for and win, we have to be aggressive. We know other states will go after the money if we don't. Alongside the work Quentin is doing to coordinate across the administration and with our partners in municipal government, this legislation will help separate Massachusetts from the rest of the nation by putting substantial, dedicated resources on the table. It will also send a clear message to Washington that we are serious and ready to move on these projects. This legislation we are filing today would leverage an interest on the State Stabilization Fund to establish a permanent pay-as-you-go capital fund. Together with the $50 million that you have already appropriated by this legislature in FY24 budget, this capital investment and debt reduction fund would allow us to make a pool of $800 million available over the next 3 years to expand the state's capacity to allocate matching funds to satisfy requirements of many of the federal grant programs and to cover a portion of those project costs. This will ensure our applications are as strong and competitive as they can be. We also dedicate $50 million of this new funding pool to ensure the competitiveness of local and regional partners through municipal matching grants and a local infrastructure bank. This fund also includes $12 million for local technical assistance to help municipalities successfully apply for federal funding opportunities. We also believe strongly that the second phase of the governor's proposal is critical to the state's long-term success and our ability to make needed investments in communities across the state. Once the appropriate opportunities presented by the IIJA, the IRA, and the CHIPS and Science Act are gone after 2026, we propose to keep this fund in place to provide capital to support a significant backlog of deferred maintenance on our state's building and facilities. This will enable the administration to advance critical projects and priorities and that have been authorized and supported by the legislature. But we have been unable to find room in our traditional capital program to fund many of these important projects. The idea of a capital fund like this is not unique among states across the country, and in fact, it's not unique to Massachusetts. From 1997 until 2010, Massachusetts, in fact, had a pay-go capital fund to support its capital program and fund many of the authorizations authorized by the legislature. It's not only a way to reduce the state's reliance on our long-term debt, but to save money on projects. It can also help accelerate projects and investments to avoid construction inflation that oftentimes makes projects more expensive. We also want to be clear about one thing. We are not proposing to touch the balance of the state's stabilization fund. We will only spend from interest generated from that fund. In this current environment, with the balance of the fund at an all-time high of $8 billion, we have a unique opportunity to use the interest generated from the fund to create something that will last longer than these federal grant opportunities, a legacy program that will continue to pay dividends for years to come. And should it start raining, we have put safeguards in this bill to ensure that the stabilization fund will start to grow again and not be impacted by this proposal. We believe this is a prudent way to unlock capital needs that we know about for a long time but haven't had the resources to deal with. I'll now turn it over to Quentin Palfrey to talk to you about other provisions of this bill. And I want to again thank you for your time. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Secretary Gorkowitz, and thank you, Chairman Lewis, Vice Chairman Hendricks, and members of the committee. My name is Quentin Palfrey. I'm Governor Healy's Director of Federal Funds and Infrastructure, and I'm delighted to be here with you today to share my support for this legislation, an act to provide for competitiveness and infrastructure investment in Massachusetts. The Healy-Driscoll administration has adopted a whole-of-government strategy to aggressively pursue a once-in-a-generation investment of federal funds made possible by Congress and the Biden-Harris administration. Our office, the Office of Federal Funds and Infrastructure, was created by executive order to maximize these federal grant opportunities and advance administration priorities on infrastructure, jobs, economic competitiveness, affordable housing, clean energy, decarbonization, resilience, equity, and workforce development. And so far, we've taken some big swings, and we're getting big results. $19 million to advance the development of microchips for defense needs, $35 million to 20 communities to support strategies that will make our streets safer, $108 million for train corridor improvements between Springfield and Worcester, $147 million to expand high-speed internet across the state and advance digital equity, and $372 million towards replacing the Cape Cod bridges. But there's much more funding at stake. In October, the Office for Administration and Finance, along with some of our external partners, like the Mass Taxpayers Foundation, did some analysis of the opportunities created by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and CHIPS and Science. And our estimates are that there are approximately $17 billion in new resources available for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts if we maximize our efforts to pursue these funds. But to truly go after and win these awards, we need an additional $1 billion of state resources to put our money where our mouth is. We've seen time and time again that when we're working with federal government agencies, being able to put state government resources on the table aligned with those federal resources has an outcome determinative effect. The legislation filed by the governor unlocks up to $750 million in state matching funds over the next 3 years, meaningfully advancing our efforts to bring federal dollars home. By creating the Commonwealth Federal Matching and Debt Reduction Fund, the legislation gives us the ability to support cities, towns, tribes, and state agencies with matching funds for federal grant applications, maximizing our competitiveness in this process. In doing so, Massachusetts will be poised to leverage historic investments in bridge and road safety, coastline resiliency, diversity, equity, and preparedness of our workforce, research and technology, innovation, housing affordability, and the availability of robust clean energy solutions. This bill is smart and fiscally prudent as a use of state dollars. Each dollar we provide in state match enables us to multiply the federal dollars we receive in return. And the Matching Fund and Debt Reduction Fund is funded exclusively from the interest on the Stabilization Fund, preserving the core of the Stabilization Fund for its intended purpose, to provide stability in fiscally challenging times. Moreover, this legislation works to address a growing and critical need: support for our cities and towns and tribes who are seeking to develop these federal grants and implement successful awards. Our office's partnership and ongoing dialogue with communities, as well as with the MMA, with the RPAs, and with other groups across the Commonwealth, has helped us to understand the need for more technical assistance for communities to write grant applications, to gather data, and planning for these important projects. This bill provides $12 million in funding so that cities and towns can better access these kinds of resources, something we've repeatedly heard across the Commonwealth is a need. Our office has seen that collaboration between state and local communities works. For example, earlier this fall, the Biden-Harris administration awarded the New Bedford Port Authority $24 million for the rehabilitation of the Leonard's Wharf. We backed that application with $18 million in state matching funds, and we believe that those state matching funds were an instrumental factor in bringing those dollars into Massachusetts. With more resources, we can scale this kind of impact across the Commonwealth. This bill helps us make the most of this unique and potentially transformative moment. It's an essential step towards not just competing for federal funds, but winning them. So I really appreciate you considering this proposal here today.
Thank you both so much for that detailed testimony. We've been joined by two other colleagues, Rep. Lenatra and Rep. Paulino. Thank you so much for joining us. And I was remiss, I didn't thank my staff. They were kind enough not to text me that I forgot to thank them. But if you were up here, they put together very detailed analysis of the bill and all of the studies that folks have put out. So really grateful to all of you. I have a couple questions as it relates to deadlines. The Senate made several changes in their version of the bill, and as the House looks this over, I'm curious about your thoughts on some of those deadlines the Senate did change in their bill. A couple that stood out to me, the governor's bill required annual reports to Ways and Means. The Senate made that quarterly reports. In another section, the original bill said by the end of 2026, a detailed report, this was in lines 44 through 63, needed to be submitted to Ways and Means. The Senate changed that to an annual report through 2026, as I understand it. And then the one that stood out to me most notably was the Senate version amended the bill that would require a 30-day notice to Ways and Means before expending funds for this purpose. And really curious if you feel those deadlines are realistic, and especially the last one that would require a 30-day notice before competing for grant dollars, not knowing what that grant window might be like. Does that allow you to be as nimble as necessary for things that are time sensitive?
Sure. Well, let me just say first, we are very much in support of the transparency and accountability that comes from the reporting requirements, both what we filed in the original bill as well as what's being proposed by our friends in the legislature. And, we can work with much of what is being proposed. I will just take each of those one at a time. The annual reporting, I think Senate moved that to quarterly reporting. I think we're fine with that. We did feel that, when we filed our bill, we wanted to, we focused on two reports. We focused on an annual report so that we could identify and, again, have some transparency on what we've reported throughout the year. And then we had a final report at the end of 26 on all of the infrastructure matching that would have happened so that we have sort of a look back and a report card on how we did on the program as a whole. The fact that that has then been proposed by the Senate to be quarterly, I think that's something we can work with and, again, support the overall efforts around greater transparency and accountability. With respect to the 30-day notification, that's something that our office is currently reviewing and working with Quinton's office on. The thing about the federal legislation is that while there's a lot of opportunities out there, we sometimes get notification by federal agencies, and sometimes the turnaround is pretty quick. I think in most cases, we probably have at least 30 days, and so on the surface, I think 30 days is something we could work with in terms of an advance notification, as long as there isn't a requirement that, we need to seek permission, because in some cases, I think, again, as federal agencies send out guidance and we have to respond to that guidance, it's sometimes difficult to anticipate what those timelines look like. But so far, our experience has been that 30 days would be enough. Now, I think we want to continue to evaluate that and provide recommendations to you all as you're considering the bill in the House to see if that creates any problems for us. But being nimble and having flexibility around those reporting deadlines will be important. The first two I mentioned, I think, are things we can work with. The 30-day notice, again, on its face of it, seems to be okay, but I think we would want to take a little bit more time to deliberate on that and provide you more details.
Thank you. Is this one of those instances where if 30 were replaced with 14, you would feel you have a little bit more breathing room, or is any deadline or any advance notice really the issue?
I think that's we were thinking, you said 14, I was thinking 15 days. We were literally cutting it in half. But so I think, yes, I think something like that does provide a little bit more flexibility and certainly fits into a window that is very comfortable for us in terms of making sure we can comply with the requirements that any of these federal agencies will have in their grant applications, and making sure that we can be nimble enough to put up our match when needed.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that, there's a difference between sort of making sure that you all have the visibility that you need to be able to perform an oversight role and conditioning the grants on some kind of approval. One of the things that's really important for the federal government agencies when they're considering these grant applications is to feel confident that if we make a promise that we're going to follow through on that. So we certainly would be more focused on the reporting than sort of conditioning the grants in some way.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Turn things over to my vice chair if you have any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, Director, thank you so much for being here and discussing this effort. I think we're in a very special time that, as you said, there's a lot of federal money available, and I think we're best off situating ourselves, in a position of competitiveness. So I think that's great. So thank you. I had a few questions. Some I may reserve for later on. Are there any type of funds currently that exist right now that the Secretary of A&F has access to, like this potential fund?
I would say not as we've proposed it. Are you asking if we have any money that's available to us to matching? Or,
right.
Yeah.
I mean, is there, because this bill puts a lot of power and discretion with the Secretary of A&F for, not only the federal granting money, but also pensions and all the other liabilities and debt. So I was just wondering if there's anything similar currently that the Secretary currently has, a power over a fund, something similar.
So we don't have anything similar. I will say that the thing that most closely parallels what we're looking at here is our capital program, which you know is debt funded. So we issue general obligation bonds to be able to support our capital program. That is something that the administration has authority over and develops plans for on an annual basis. We develop a 5-year capital investment plan. So I would say that this, what we're proposing through this federal infrastructure bill, it most closely resembles what the administration does on an annual basis to manage our capital investment plan. The funding sources are a little bit different. The capital plan is funded through GO debt, whereas this would be funded in cash from the state's interest in the stabilization fund. And one of the things we've proposed in this bill, as you know, is a permanent pay-go capital program that sits alongside our capital investment plan. So I think they're most closely resemble each other. And part of the goal here was to actually have some of that flexible pay-go capital to support our capital program going forward. As you may know, our capital plan only grows by about $125 million a year. It's a lot of constraints, and there's a lot of demand, both in terms of many of the projects that all of you have authorized in various bond bills, as well as our infrastructure needs. And so trying to keep up with that is a challenge. This pay-go capital program, sitting alongside our debt-funded capital program, would provide a real boost in our ability to address some of those critical needs. But in the short term, it serves as an opportunity for us to leverage that to address federal infrastructure dollars. So I think that would be where I would draw some parallel, some comparisons and some similarities in terms of how we manage and operate those funds.
So, but certainly the addition of, the Secretary's power and discretion to spend on, like the pension liabilities, kind of the general types of stuff, that there's nothing similar as far as that side of things.
There is some small pot of money that's been available, debt defeasance fund, that is funded through some of the gaming revenues. That fund generates roughly $25 or $30 million a year, so a smaller pot of money that allows us to work with the Treasurer's Office on coming up with creative financing solutions around debt defeasance. It's a debt defeasance fund, actually, so that has some similarities to it as well. But this is, so I'd say there are a couple of things on a smaller scale that we could point to for sure.
Thank you. And I'll yield back to the chairman. Thank you.
Other members of the committee with questions? First, I want to note we were joined by Rep. Hamilton, Rep. McGregor. Thank you for getting us. One day I'm going to be able to say your last name without stumbling over. I don't know. Make you an action hero, I think, is where my mind is going. McGregor. Any questions from members of the committee?
Yeah.
Yes.
Good morning. My question is this. We are, the revenue of the state has not met the benchmark or the estimate that we have. So we have a shortfall. Well, let's say by the third quarter of this year, the revenue increased, so we have more money to spend. Is anything in this bill that will stop the usage of those rainy day funds?
So if I understand your question, we're proposing to use the interest generated on the stabilization fund to fund this pay-go capital. And I think what I hear your question is if revenues continue on form or if the stabilization fund is needed, are you concerned about the impact of the stabilization fund?
My question is, if our revenue improve and meet projections, we may not have the need to use those funds that we have there for reserve. There is something in this bill that will stop the usage of those funds because we have enough revenue now. It's because the spending of this bill will go up to December 31st, 2026. And let's say 2 quarters from now, the revenue are meeting the benchmark. We are collecting enough money for the expenditure of the budget. Even if we just do a flat budget meeting equal to what we spent the year before. There is anything in this bill from the Senate, from the governor, that automatically stop the need of use those funds?
There's nothing in the original bill that the governor filed or in the bill that has been sent to you from the Senate that would stop the use of these funds if revenues came in over benchmark and we were sitting on, at the end of the year, a big surplus, if that's the analogy you're drawing. I will say that I think, even in a situation where the Commonwealth was expecting strong revenue performance and revenues were exceeding benchmarks, thus resulting in a surplus at the end of the year, we still think with an $8 billion stabilization fund balance, this is an appropriate use of the interest to be able to create some additional capital capacity, both in the short term to deal with our infrastructure needs in terms of coming up with matching dollars, but also to support and complement many of the authorizations that you as the legislature have identified are important projects that we need to get done. And so I think even with an opportunity or an environment where we were experiencing surplus funds, we think this is an appropriate opportunity and to take advantage of having such a healthy rainy day fund and having an opportunity where interest rates right now actually yield some substantial resources that we could reinvest. And by reinvesting it, what we're doing is we're sort of bending the trend on how much long-term debt we have to issue over a long period of time. By having a pay-go capital program, we can issue less debt, and that's good for the Commonwealth, and it's good for our long-term fiscal health. So even in that situation, I think we would propose that this proposal makes sense, and therefore there has been nothing in the bill the governor filed or in the Senate bill that would pause this program, even in the event of additional revenues.
I understand, and I agree mostly with what you just stated, but isn't the inspiration and motivation for this bill the shortfall on revenue that we have right now? Isn't the foundation of this bill isn't because we are not collecting enough tax of at least what we expect will be collected by now? That's a question.
I think the premise behind this bill, again, was to take advantage of one of the highest rainy stabilization funds in the country. I think we have one of the third highest balances, and to take advantage of both the interest rates that are currently that we currently have that will help generate some revenue and create a program that I think, again, addresses one of our long-term liabilities. That was really the premise behind it.
The program is good. Sorry that I interrupted. The program is good. But basically what you're telling me right now is that we just going to, even if we were collecting enough revenue, we didn't have a shortfall, this program would be good just because we have money, we need to spend it. So that's what I'm getting for you, and I would like to get an answer. If we are creating this bill inspired because we have a shortfall, and let's say in 2 quarters from now, we no longer have a projected shortfall, and we don't have the need of this bill, although those programs are good. So you still believe we should continue spending the money, although we are collecting more revenue, or the revenue we expect to collect?
Sorry.
So if I may, Representative, I think that part of the premise of this bill is that we have a unique once-in-a-generation opportunity that's created by pieces of federal legislation. So while there is some, there's the connection with our overall fiscal health of the Commonwealth, I think part of the argument that we're making here is that we have a historic opportunity to seize funds that the federal government has made available on a short-term basis in connection with the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and CHIPS and Science. And during that window of opportunity, we need to be aggressive in seeking those funds. And one of the ways that we can be aggressive in bringing more revenue into the Commonwealth is to have the ability to make these state matching fund commitments. So we've come up with a mechanism that allows us to pursue these once-in-a-generation opportunities in an all-of-government kind of a way that aligns with what we think of as our long-term fiscal health as well. So I don't think that the rationale of this bill is solely because of what's happening in the short term with our revenues. It's largely motivated by our desire to be really aggressive with these federal funds.
Thank you.
I think it's also good to remember that the governor filed this bill in October before we knew what the budget picture was looking like going into this new year. Mm-hmm. And I know some in the media have connected this issue and this bill with our current budget situation as it relates to tax revenue, even the scheduling of this hearing. And I'll just say, I don't know how to procrastinate. So when the bill came to our committee, we found the next available date and we invited you. So drawing any connection between the two is something I know folks are doing, but your office filed this in October. And so I want to just note that. The question did bring up the point around only using the interest if the rainy day fund is at least at 10%. I know the Senate explored raising that to 15%, but didn't go down that road. Rep. Cataldo, I know you had some questions on this front. Did you want to take this moment to?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Let's get you a microphone.
Mr. Secretary. It's great to see you, and thank you so much for being here and for your testimony and for answering your questions, which has already enlightened me quite a bit about this bill. It's really exciting, and glad that we're seizing the moment and taking steps to be creative about these opportunities in front of us. As the chairman alluded to, I was just pondering why 10% and just kind of doing the back of the envelope map. It seems like that would project a very significant decrease in our rainy day fund if we did get to that level based on where we are now. As you mentioned a couple of times, we're at a historic level now. So what is it that would possibly cause us to go down that far since this bill, I think very wisely, is really only using the interest on the fund? How would that happen? Thank you.
So I think a couple of points to your question. Let me just start off by saying I think we viewed the 10%. First of all, there are two thresholds to this bill. So we do believe that we have put in appropriate guardrails to safeguard the stabilization fund in the event of a downturn and an event where the stabilization fund would be needed. The first safeguard is the fact that we established that this program would be predicated on having a stabilization fund balance that's at least 10% of the operating budget, which in this case is about $5 billion, or $5.5 billion. And, you know, I think what we believed was that creates a critical mass where you can have a substantial program to be able to use the interest, regardless of what the interest rate is. Even in a low interest rate environment, you would still have enough interest being generated to support a pay-go capital program that was worthwhile. And so we decided that, you know, 10% of the operating budget would be a good first threshold to have a critical program, something that would be generating enough interest to fund a capital program. The other requirement that we worked on with the Treasurer's Office was to say that in any given year, if we had an economic downturn and we had to rely on the stabilization fund, then in those years we would forego the interest just in that year only until we ended up depositing money back into the stabilization fund. I would also say that even in the you know, situation we're currently in, where revenues have been underperforming, you know, the governor has taken swift and decisive action earlier this year to try to bring revenues in line with where we thought they were going to end. And it's our goal not to, as I've mentioned in our testimony, to touch the balance of the stabilization fund. So we believe that both criteria of this legislation, both guardrails will be met, and the safeguards will continue to operate and allow us to run this program.
Thank you. Could I ask a follow-up, Mr. Chairman? Is 10% as some kind of industry standard as it concerns the bond rating? Is there any, or is that just kind of the intuition is that that's an appropriate and responsible level?
A couple things. One is, you know, 10% of the at one point, 10% of the state budget was a threshold that was talked about in terms of having an appropriate stabilization fund balance. We're certainly well above that. Even if we were to bring it down to 10%, if you were to compare where our stabilization fund balance would be across other states, we would still be one of the top highest stabilization funds. So again, I think our feeling was that recognizing that from time to time, there are probably legitimate situations where you would need to use the rainy day fund, and in those cases we wanted to be able to put some safeguards in that made sure that a program like this could be funded in perpetuity, while also building in the understanding that sometimes a rainy day fund is in fact needed. And we have, you know, a history going over 20 years where in fact we've had economic downturns sufficient enough where using the stabilization fund would be required. So I think those were the factors that went into building it. It was really more of starting from a position of making sure we had a sufficient balance and less about do we have a projection for what we might need or use.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, could I ask one more?
You can.
Thank you. With regard to the $750 million, under what circumstances would we be able to achieve that amount in terms of the funding of the federal matching and debt reduction fund. So for instance, if we were just going off of interest, is there any economic environment in which that's feasible, or does 750 million kind of presume that there would be further appropriations down the line into the fund?
It does not assume any further appropriations. We believe this will be supported entirely from the interest on the stabilization fund, and in fact, we're insulating ourselves from the need of having to do any other appropriations, and also insulating ourselves from having the capital budget be able to have to pick up a lot of these matching requirements, which would put much really undue burden on the capital program and create an additional strain for an already pressured budget. We think that based on last year's interest earnings, we believe that the projections that we have are appropriate for sizing this. If the interest ends up being, less or more, we'll work and adjust the program accordingly. But we believe that these are our best estimates based on what's happened historically and in the past year.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your testimony here today. We appreciate it. And certainly, I think, echoing the sentiments of some of my colleagues this morning, tomorrow as we kick off Ways and Means hearing, we're watching an issue like this much more closely than we did a few months ago when it was filed. And so I understand that the circumstances were extremely different than what the financial picture looks like now. So obviously we're extremely concerned about those numbers. I think that most of my colleagues would agree anytime we can pursue federal dollars that come into the coffers of Massachusetts is a good opportunity. But we're talking about 3 federal legislative initiatives primarily, about $1.4 trillion, I think is what was said, and we've identified about $17.5 billion for Massachusetts. Can you tell us a little bit about that $17.5 billion figure, how you came up with it? Is it stuff unique to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts? Is it what we feel our best pursuit of federal matching funds is? Can you give us a little sense of where that figure came from an overall pool that's $1.4 trillion?
Do you want to take this?
Well, I can. We basically went through the IIJA, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the IRA Act, and program by program, we identified what was available. We worked with our executive branch agencies to identify what would be appropriate. Some of it is formulaic driven, so we know that as a percentage in terms of what we receive through other federal dollars, that we can anticipate that $17 billion flowing to Massachusetts. So in the first instance, we did an analysis based on what we typically get in Massachusetts based on programs like this that have been done in the past, and then we went systematically through each of the bills and worked with our agencies to identify within that certain programs that we believe would be programs that we would want to go after and that would have a benefit to Massachusetts, and we sized this program based on what we think is reasonable.
Yeah, now I will say that the estimates that we've developed internally are consistent with some of what our external partners have suggested may be available. But as Secretary Gorkowitz said, there are a number of different programs. Some of them are formulaic. Some of them are discretionary programs that are competitive. And one of the places where we think having additional state match will be extremely helpful, not only for the Commonwealth, but also for municipalities, is being able to sweeten the pot and punch above our weight in those programs. There also are significant tax incentives that are in connection with the Inflation Reduction Act that we can optimize through the use of some of this programming. But we do, this is a full program of activities. It involves a whole of government strategy of competing for these funds and being really aggressive in identifying these opportunities. It's a program that involves supporting our municipalities and making sure that as your communities are thinking about your needs and how you can tap into these federal resources, that we're there every step of the way as a partner, providing both technical assistance and financial support for those applications. So we should think about this not just as the Commonwealth, as an entity of state government, but as Team Massachusetts, as your communities, our universities, our businesses, our workforce benefiting from these resources. We certainly don't limit our analysis to the state resources in those ways.
I appreciate you saying that, and I'm glad to see that our new rural director is here, my former colleague from the central and western part of the state. But that's one of the reasons that I've gone down this path, is because particularly if we're looking for local municipalities, smaller communities, to have skin in the game, which, you know, we embrace in terms of matching resources and opportunity to pursue, we want to make sure that we have time to get them into the mindset as well of some of these programs that we may be targeting as a Commonwealth, but that ultimately trickle down to the local cities and towns that we represent. So I think the opportunity is great. Obviously, we're looking at the bottom line extremely carefully because of the financial picture in the Commonwealth. But is it safe to say that that $17.5 billion figure could conceivably be more based upon these three pots of money that are out there?
I think that it's the analysis that we've come up with and that our external partners have suggested maybe a reasonable target for us. And it is, by the way, the ambitious, that's what we're aiming for. And what we think that these resources may allow us to accomplish. But certainly, some of these tax incentives in particular have a very high upper bound in that way. I do want to underscore something that I think that you highlighted, which is the importance. And I'm thrilled to have our Director of Rural Affairs here, former Senator Ann Goby, has been a key partner in this effort. But one of the things that we're very focused on is making sure that the whole Commonwealth gets the benefit of these federal opportunities. One of the things that we've done throughout the course of this administration, and the Lieutenant Governor has done listening tours in a number of your communities. We have worked with MMA to hear from communities, and we've recently launched this federal funds partnership. One of the things we hear from communities across the Commonwealth is that they hear that these opportunities are exciting. They want to know more, but they need more support in doing this. So we want to provide them with technical support. We want to provide them with state matching fund. And we also want to give them good information, actionable information about these opportunities as they go along. The other thing you mentioned in terms of the financial moment we find ourselves in, I just want to underscore one piece of what we're proposing here. We are not proposing to spend this money except under circumstances where the federal government is putting money in. And so what we're doing is we're leveraging the interest on the state rainy day fund to create opportunities for us to pursue federal resources that we can bring into Massachusetts. So the time when the money actually goes out the door is going to be under circumstances where the federal funds are flowing into Massachusetts. So this is a very fiscally responsible mechanism because we're leveraging the interest, but we don't actually spend the money unless we're bringing in federal dollars. So this is going to be net positive for our revenue situation rather than a burden on the state's fiscal.
And I think pointing that out is extremely important, again, because of the change in the financial picture, but the guardrails that you had mentioned previously, I think are going to be important to a lot of members of this legislature. So thank you for your testimony today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to need enough advance notice to get one of those giant checks that will fit all the zeros for 17.5. So speaking of deadlines, we've been introducing Ann Goby, so I just want to thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure we'll have follow-up questions, and if you have additional things for us, please send them our way. But
Thank
again,
you very
both
much,
of you,
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you.
Next, we have Director of Rural Affairs, who I think's been sort of introduced by 3 or 4 folks already, but no stranger to any of us here. Director, I think the last time we were in this room together, we were testifying on a bill we filed relating to apartment dwellers and rental insurance as it relates to dogs. Just a reminder, we
Thank you for
we cover
that.
lots
That's
of
right.
things.
We have
trip
a
down
lot,
memory
a lot
lane.
of history, and I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman and Vice Chair and the members of the committee. And I'm very pleased to be here to testify in support of S 2554. For the record, I am Ann Goby, Director of Rural Affairs. I want to thank Quinton and the Secretary Gorkowitz for giving such a wonderful overview and taking all the hard questions. So that makes it easier for me. I also appreciate that the focus the Governor and Lieutenant Governor have placed on the 181 rural communities. And in fact, just on this committee, 11 of those communities, you have one, I believe in Carlisle. Representative Tara has, I think, 3, probably 3. But you get the jackpot, Representative Smola. His entire district is all rural communities, the 7 towns that the rep represents so well. And he knows specifically, and I know our other rural legislators do too, that our rural communities, when you go into the town halls, what do you see? It's mainly part-time staff, of volunteers doing every aspect of municipal government. And I bet if I asked you how many of them have a dedicated grant writer, they probably don't. It's unheard of. And that's what makes this so important, that one section of this bill that would allow for matching funds, because so often we hear, and I'm sure you've heard it too, that you hear from these small towns say, boy, we'd love to apply for that grant, but we don't even have the 20,000 or 25,000 or whatever it is in order to even go after that. This allows them, this gives a pathway to allow rural communities to apply for grants that they normally would not. It's going to increase their competitiveness in the federal grant process and bring resources necessary to develop and implement those grants. That ability to do that, to have that match, can be absolutely transformative for our rural communities. And so I know that you will take this into consideration. I appreciate the support that this committee has given to our rural communities and the legislature as a whole, but this gives you an opportunity to really kind of put the stamp on that you support our rural communities. So I thank you, and I respectfully request that the bill be discharged favorably.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I just had one question.
Yes, sir.
I can't speak for the larger committee, but I only have one. The Senate proposed an amendment that sought to direct A&F to prioritize projects that promoted economic development in distressed areas, or economically distressed areas. That amendment didn't go forward, but just curious your thoughts as the Director of Rural Affairs.
So, I think one of the things, as we look in what was already mentioned, that part of what this bill will do is to make sure that every corner of the Commonwealth benefits. That it's not just the larger areas, it's not just the gateway cities. And rural communities will not be forgotten within this bill.
That's right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions from folks? Yes. Smolak.
Thank you. Director, thank you very much for your testimony here today. And I'm so happy that the governor made the selection that she did for this new position because of your background.
Just to get me out of your hair now?
Just to get, yeah. Well, that's the second reason,
Yeah,
as a matter of fact. But, you know, working with you in the legislature for all these years, but your background for the 27 or 28 communities that you represented in rural territory, I think really does make a difference. But I can't stress enough the comments that you just made relative to these smaller municipalities in Massachusetts, that as much as we have great grant programs, we have great support infrastructure in the state of Massachusetts. It's awesome. But when you have a small resource that a municipality can't even put up matching funds, $5,000, $6,000 for a program, and say, sorry, we just can't do it, that's pretty disheartening. And it's easy to see how small rural communities get discouraged. So I think there's hope in this legislative proposal as we work through it. And I like to see the focus of rural communities as a component of their stay true throughout this process from start to finish. So I appreciate your testimony and hope we really stick hard and fight for that component.
Thank you, and I appreciate your support.
Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
I'm going to turn over chairing responsibilities to my vice chair for the next little bit.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this time, I'd like to welcome Casey Bowers from ELN.
Chair Hendricks, Chair Lewis, members of the committee, thank you for allowing me to testify today. I'm here to also add our strong support and urge a favorable and quick report on S2554. I think you've heard quite a bit about the details of the bill, so I'll focus on why you're hearing from ELM. And for the record, I am Casey Bowers, the Executive Director of the Action Fund for the Environmental League of Massachusetts. Meeting our 2050 and 2030 climate and clean energy goals while placing Massachusetts on the path towards an economy-wide decarbonization by 2050 is going to require significant public investment. Modernizing and electrifying our transportation system, building and connecting renewable energy infrastructure, reducing emissions from our built environment, and rapidly increasing the size of our electric grid offer a lot of benefits, from creating good-paying jobs, improving public health, and reducing disparities among communities. We can make Massachusetts a more attractive place to live and work. But the upfront costs of this net zero transition pale in comparison to the astronomical cost, avoided cost of inaction on climate. So making these time-limited opportunities to invest federal funds in our green infrastructure close to home is really critical. While we know that the federal funding cannot facilitate the Commonwealth's net zero transition completely, the state climate chief estimates these 3 federal bills alone could fund up to 30% of the state's spending needs for decarbonization. It's important to recognize that this funding will not be available indefinitely, and time is of the essence with many important programs authorized under these federal laws. For example, the $27 billion Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund created by the IRA and managed by the EPA is entirely distributed through competitive grants and managed and only available through September 30th of this year. Most of the transportation programs are only available through September 2026. Advancing, passing, and finalizing this legislation must occur as quick as possible, knowing all that you have on your plates. But this will allow the state to be able to take advantage of utilizing these funds and allow capital planning that occurs on multi-year timelines to be done most efficiently. So we really urge your quick consideration, and thank you again for allowing me to testify.
Thank you, Executive Director Bowers. I appreciate your testimony.
Casey will be just fine.
Are there any questions from the committee? Representative Paulino?
Good morning. Like 2 months ago, we voted for the supplemental budget, and I think we appropriate a couple $100 million from the interest of the rainy fund that we have. And I'm grateful that we have those fundings, we have the interest, so we can, in time of emergency, use it. But by implementing this program, this bill, and I'm afraid if we run into a really downfall on revenue, something happen, we don't have access to those interests. We already have planned for that. And so my question is, how you think we can work in regards to that? In time, if we ever need like a supplemental budget and we need $250, $300 million, and we don't have those available because we're using it already, how the stabilization fund we destabilize the tool that we have to have extra fund where we need it?
I think what some of the administration officials really focused on is that this is for the 3-year period, and beyond that, it's only used when we are not using the stabilization fund. So when it is raining and we have to use the stabilization fund, these extra dollars that we're using off of interest won't be available. But I would also say from the perspective of ELM is we have all these daunting environmental costs hanging over our heads. We've seen worse storms, we've seen flood damage. You know, the cost of not doing anything on climate and not taking advantage, particularly when we can leverage all these federal funds to take advantage of programs that we need to start addressing in Massachusetts, it would be a real shame, and we think it would be a lost opportunity. So while I respect that the economy has taken a little bit of a slowdown, I think there are clear safeguards in this bill that would protect the rainy day fund and protect the leverage that the state has to address issues that should arise if the economy does not continue. But I would also urge us to think that, as I kind of mentioned, these 3 federal bills will only be available for a short amount of time, and we'll be leaving funding on the table that will address critical infrastructure needs, climate needs that will save us money in the future. So I would recommend that this is a good use of our funds and that there are plenty of safeguards in place.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions? Oh, Mr. Chairman?
I know on the Senate side there were a couple amendments that would require that sustainability be prioritized in the spending of these funds. Again, like other amendments, they weren't incorporated in the final. In your position, with your expertise, do you feel that the bill as written adequately will allow the state to address issues around sustainability and climate change?
I do think as it stands that it is prepared to take advantage of the federal funds. I would say that the need for flexibility and to go after the funds that make the most sense considering how competitive the structure is right now. The state is getting about 3% of all climate funds from the federal bills, and part of that is, that Massachusetts hasn't been as competitive, and so I think to provide the most flexibility to go after the grants that make the most sense is the critical need at this point. And there are clear guidelines in those bills, and I would point out Justice 40 as one that would really ensure equity around the environmental justice communities, and so I think that their flexibility is most important at this point.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Sure.
It's fair to say you wouldn't be opposed to any amendment that outlined any sustainability goals.
When have you known ELM to be against sustainability? So no, for the record, I don't. I would not oppose anything, but I do think that it's really well done.
Further questions? Thank you very much for your
All right,
testimony.
thank you.
I'd like to now welcome Norman Abbott, Senior Government Affairs Specialist for MAPC.
Good morning, Chair Lewis, Chair Hendricks, and members of the committee. Thank you for the chance to offer testimony in support of S2554, a bill that will provide the Commonwealth with matching funds that can make our federal grant applications more competitive and in some cases possible. I'm here today on behalf of the Massachusetts Association of Regional Planning Agencies, or MARPA, the organization representing our 13 regional planning agencies, provide support to all 351 municipalities in Massachusetts. We serve as the premier advocate for cities and towns to help program federal transportation and economic development resources, innovate the delivery of municipal public services, collaborate across regional boundaries, and adopt planning best practices. There's currently a once-in-a-generation opportunity to access federal funding, and billions of dollars are available to help address issues as disparate as culvert repair and semiconductor supply shortages. However, it's difficult for many of our municipalities to access these funds because of matching requirements that can be as high as 50%. Each of the 13 regional planning agencies work with municipalities to bring these critical federal funds to our communities via DLTAA, funds provided by the budget. These funds allow RPA to help municipalities understand the federal opportunities available and apply for them. While other states have county governments and other regional mechanisms to help fund projects and apply on behalf of municipalities, we do not. These DLTAA funds have expanded the capacity of RPAs to better serve our cities and towns and help them compete for federal funding. Swift action is needed to ensure that we do not miss out on potential opportunities that could fund the electrification of the commuter rail, microgrids, and crucial projects in EJ communities. While funding for many programs will remain available into 2031, other opportunities will conclude as early as this year. Without matching funds, we'll lose a chance at winning millions of federal dollars. Additionally, while the BIL provides unseen levels of infrastructure funding, authorization concludes at the end of federal fiscal year 26, with some opportunities concluding even before then. S2554 constructs an impactful solution to problems by creating a fund to assist the Commonwealth and municipalities to pursue many of these opportunities without having to raise additional taxes or make cuts to programs. This will be done by leveraging interest for earnings on the State Stabilization Fund, which should generate $250 million a year to support federal applications. Failure to pass this legislation means foregoing crucial investments that many of our municipalities need. Leaving this money on the table could result in municipalities footing the entire bill themselves in the years ahead, which could put them in a similar position when the next major federal funding bill comes around. Thanks for the attention to this important matter, and I welcome any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Mr. Abbott, thank you for your testimony. I do have one quick question. From a municipality standpoint, is there anything in this bill that jumps out at you that we could either put in or amend to make it easier for cities and towns in this effort?
I think it makes a lot of sense right now, and I think that it's structured in a way that is impactful. I think that one of the things that makes the most sense is sort of, just getting it done as quickly as possible because, I think as a lot of folks have highlighted, these resources are running out, and we want to make sure that folks have the ability to access it. I think similarly, making sure that, we can sort of change that narrative. I think a lot of folks have saw it, specifically in the rural communities, have said, we just don't have the capacity, no more NOFOs, please don't send them to us. So as soon as this can pass and get out there and we can sort of change that narrative that this funding is available, I think we'll see a lot of really good results for the Commonwealth. Vice Chair.
Thank you. Any further questions? Rep. Codaldo?
Thank you, Mr. Acting Chairman. And it's really great to see a fellow Concord Carlisle High School graduate testifying today. The very first meeting that I had with the town manager in Carlisle was exactly this topic. When Kyle, my legislative aide, and I sat down with him, he was walking us through all of the great opportunities that were out there that Carlisle didn't have the resources to pursue. So just really excited to see that this is part of the bill. And I'm wondering if you can kind of unpack a little bit what is the mechanism by which the smaller or more rural municipalities would be able to pursue these funds? Is it that there is funding that's coming to the community to give them resources to work on grants like this? Or would it be the state bureaucracy that's actually doing the grant application itself?
So MAPC and the other RPAs all have funding that the legislature here and the governor have made available through the budget to help with this process. And so they can reach out directly either to me or to any of their relative RPA to make sure that they're getting in touch with the correct folks to help with that application. I know coming from the federal side previously, you saw a lot of folks, saying, we'd speak to them saying these opportunities are available, and they're just like, we can't do it, excuse me. So one of the nice things that the RPAs can do is they can actually come in and work with them on these applications, but also sort of make regional applications as well, which might make some of these rural applications even more competitive. So make a more efficient use of sort of this funding coming down instead of sort of being a one-time for one community. So we've done a lot of work both in the MAPC region, and I know a lot of our partners have sought to do that work as well elsewhere in the Commonwealth.
Thank you for mentioning regionalization, because that was the second point that Carlisle raised, was how much more competitive they thought that their pursuit of funding would be if they could regionalize certain applications and services. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Further questions? Seeing none? Thank you very much, Mr. Robert.
You.
Appreciate it. And at this time, I'm going to yield back to the chairman, Representative Lewis.
Thank you so much. And as you're talking, Rep. Cataldo, I'm remembering similar conversations in Ashland, especially around the regional competitiveness communities that don't have the capacity to hire a full-time grant writer. Next, we have interim president from the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center, Phineas Baxendel. I type your email all the time, but I've never had to say it aloud. Phineas, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you all for having me here, Chair Lewis, Vice Chair Hendricks, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to give testimony here today in support of Senate Bill 2554. I'm president of Mass Budget, a think tank that's conducted analysis for over 35 years to improve public policy in Massachusetts. And I want to speak specifically to the long-term financial prudence of Senate Bill 2554. The bill both protects the strength of the Commonwealth Stabilization Fund and leverages its funding for further growth and stability. It does not shrink the fund, only decelerates its further growth when the fund has swollen to already adequate levels. If the fund is sufficient, it is an extra level of caution to restrict the funds from the excess capital gains. Most of my comments are about the excess capital gains redirection. It is an extra level of caution to restrict the use to debt reduction, a use which improves the soundness and resilience of state finances without creating new obligations or operational needs. Similarly, making funds available to match and pursue the state federal grants with the interest would enable us to be more nimble in pursuing opportunities for the federal funds, as folks here have already spoken about. Just for context, according to the National Association of State Budget Officials, NASBO, only California and Texas, much larger states, have rainy day funds larger than Massachusetts. The current balance has swollen to $8.27 billion, which is an unprecedented level and over 14% of the FY24 budget. Looking back at past research from the Boston Federal Reserve from 2014, concluded that Massachusetts, specifically Massachusetts, finances the rainy day funds required to protect spending without need for a tax increase or cuts in the face of a median recession would be 5.5% of state expenditures and 10.2% for a maximum recession need. Without policy adjustments, it may be the case that our stabilization fund will just continue to grow and claim larger parts of our budget each year. Some of our stabilization fund being so large is due to the unprecedented pandemic aid, but insofar as a major source of it is the excess capital gains, there are larger term secular trends that we can more speculatively point to as perhaps a source of this change. One reason is that a large body of research from the Federal Reserve and elsewhere shows that wealth in the United States has become more and more concentrated in the hands of a few tax filers. And these wealthy tax filers receive a much larger portion of their income in the form of capital gains. So to the extent that more income is going to highly wealthy people, there is more income in the economy going to capital gains and hence more excess capital gains. There has been a longer-term trend towards greater capital gains as a portion of the economy. Maybe it's concentration of wealth, maybe it's financialization of the economy. But it's not unrealistic to think that this may be part of a long-term kind of swelling of the stabilization fund that this bill would be responsive to. But the benefits of this bill do not depend on that being the case. It's not that if that's all wrong, what I just said in the last 30 seconds, there's no harm because none of the effects take place unless it's over 10%, right? So we're protected against that. The policy triggers will revert to the old status quo if the case comes that we get back to under 10%. The bill also, just to reinforce that the bill never reduces the stabilization fund, but just adjusts its growth mechanisms depending on its size. So I urge passage of this bill and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. As we discussed earlier, are you also comfortable with the 10% number?
Yeah.
It's fiscally sound, in your opinion?
I think it's certainly fiscally sound. I think, if you ask someone sort of, would it be more safe to require 3 fire alarms in each room of a house? I think, there's probably an argument that the answer is yes, and it would be nice to have a 50% of the budget stabilization fund, but it's also at some point, there are also other opportunity costs.
And a direct question, you talked about the capital gain allocation and changes the Senate made there. Comparing and contrasting the governor's original bill and the Senate version as it relates to this, do you have an opinion about which is more fiscally sound or suggestions to edit either of them?
No, I think one of the things of note is just the focus on the pensions and the OPEBs. When the larger the stabilization fund gets as a portion of the budget, the more. Right now in the status quo it's 5%, and that grows under the bill. I think that is certainly a suitable place for it to go. Bond markets, if a state has a disastrous pension fund or OPEB fund, that is a kind of a dark cloud against its fiscal strength, and it's certainly, the state is stronger if those things are under, and it's not creating sort of new needs to do so. I wouldn't say that those funds are necessarily uniquely suited for it. As the speaker from ELM was talking about, we definitely are going to have needs for more climate investments, and so if somebody wanted to make the case to say that, money should go to climate resilience, there'd be an argument for that, for instance.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Other questions from committee members? Seeing none,
Okay,
thank you so
thank
much
you.
again. We only have 2 more folks that have signed up to testify, so thank you everyone for your patience, and it's been a good conversation, very informative. Next we have Dave Kaufman, Senior Executive and Legislative Director from the MMA. Dave, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Chair Lewis and Vice Chair Hendricks and members of the committee. I really appreciate all your attention on this essential issue for certainly the Commonwealth's competitiveness, as well as making sure we can leverage once-in-a-lifetime resources for cities and towns across Massachusetts, all 351. I'm Dave Kaufman, as the chair mentioned, Senior Executive and Legislative Director at the MMA. And I know there was a lot already covered, I think, in terms of just how we want to make this as universally applicable to cities and towns in every corner, in every region. And at the same time, the additional support that many of those cities and towns really do need, and it's absolutely necessary. And I will just mention, these are federal opportunities. This is talking about innovation. This is talking about resilient infrastructure, as well as a lot of us also on the front lines on dealing with climate change. So this is really well positioned and really well appreciated for the swift action that this committee is doing to take a look at this and consider it for the House. I want to also thank certainly the Healy Driscoll administration for filing this, for their leadership, for Director Palfrey's leadership, also, of course, Director Goby, who we work with very closely as well, for their work in really dealing with this, creating the state infrastructure, right? The executive order that created the Federal Funds Office to really position this type of legislative effort. I think it's something that over the last 4+ months, we've had regular calls, regular conversations, and I'll echo what I think has come up in some of the questions of the committee, but as we talk about the once-in-a-generation, once-in-a-lifetime aspect of these funds, we're often responded by many of our local officials, what does that mean for me, right? And it's a fair question, and oftentimes it's a difficult answer because a lot of it does depend, and that's not I'm not an attorney, so I can't really say that with that much confidence, but it really does depend. And I think the infrastructure of creating the Massachusetts office and with Director Palfrey's leadership and his great team is essential with that, right? We're talking about the type of technical support, and in many cases, just trying to troubleshoot a long list of potential opportunities for a community to be like, okay, where am I well positioned, and how can I then move forward? Because potential federal funding, you had us at hello in that kind of moment. So this is where I think the state utilizing this one-time process through the legislation, the underlying legislation before you is, I think, not just well-timed, but really also incredibly urgent. And I know some of the timeline was already mentioned by some of the other presenters earlier today. So I really urge your consideration. We certainly urge this committee to push this bill favorably, and we thank you for all of your support for cities and towns, both in the past and certainly on your ongoing support. So thank you. Thank you for the time. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. The MMA back in October published an article in favor of the governor's bill, I think noting, was it $12 million to support for local municipalities in order to compete for these federal dollars. Can you unpack that a little and just help us better understand?
No, I appreciate that question, Chair, and I think it does get into some of what we're talking about. I know in the conversation related to our rural communities, it was focused on not having existing grant writing staff, and it also is in partnership with the regional planning agencies in different regions. So how can they get good information, right? And I believe Director Palfrey mentioned that, making sure that they get good information on where they can be well positioned, knowing that, my perspective, right, I may be overly conservative in what I say, it could be a good opportunity, but having the expertise through the state office, in partnering with the great expertise at the regional planning agencies is the best way to leverage that, certainly on helping with grants and helping with really identifying a really vast landscape of these issues. I think that's really what that funding is for, and I think that will be well needed.
No, that's very helpful. I think the same article mentioned $50 million for a proposed local infrastructure bank that I think the Senate may have cut in their final bill. I don't think anyone else has had a chance to talk about that yet. And curious sort of what your thoughts are about not only the proposed $50 million bank, but the idea that it would be cut.
Yeah, and my understanding, Mr. Chair, is that there is some change in the language, absolutely. But what we're mostly focused on is that there's still dedicated funding specifically for municipalities, and I know other political subdivisions, but municipalities that would be able to have matching grant funding, loans that really fit and would be able to, in partnership with the state office, of federal funds help really leverage these different grants. So my understanding is that there's still a mechanism there. It may not be exactly as worded. We're still working through that, but certainly having something that would be dedicating, I think, at least $50 million as part of this is absolutely essential, and I think will be well utilized fairly quickly based on some of the funding on the table.
So the technical mechanism isn't as important as making sure that the funds are available
Yes.
and easily accessible. That's helpful. And if in the days ahead, after giving it more reflection, you have
Sure.
Any proposals in language
Appreciate that.
there or some additional thoughts, please reach out to us.
Appreciate it.
You understand this work, and you work with all of our municipalities, and we're grateful for that. Any other questions from committee members? Yes.
I just want to make a point, like, by all means, I agree with investment to bring federal money to get invested in Massachusetts. But part of what I have been reading is that they haven't identified yet which program they will pursue. We don't have the names, we don't have the total number. So basically, we are mortgaging our financial stability to stay to pursue something that we don't know which program and how they will benefit the whole Commonwealth, you know. And I would love to have more information. Which program are we talking about? We're talking about chips, microchip. So that means that most of this money will go to private companies. Well, but where those companies will go? So I would like to have more information. I don't see that here. But I agree. We should pursue federal money, but we need to be fiscally responsible as well. Just because we go to the mall and we see a lot of discount doesn't mean that we need to buy it. If we don't have the resources to responsibly spend it, just because they are in discount price, doesn't mean that we need to buy it as a person. And as a state, I think we need to be also responsible, and that's my job to ask the question for my community. And I would like to have more information. Which program are we talking about, and where those funds will go?
Absolutely. And Representative, I appreciate your question. I think it does get into certainly concerns over, and again, any decision that you would make in terms of expending funds for a specific purpose. I think for this, I think reflective of a lot of the other testimony you've seen today, it does talk about, again, the urgency on the federal funds, and yes, you can make a decision on whether this will be able to pursue or not. I'd say without this type of mechanism, I think we'd have still some significant work on federal grants, but it would not be as universal as we need, and maybe it would just help some municipalities, maybe those that may just be well positioned at their capacity to have it, to have the grant writing staff, and certainly for the MMA that supports all cities and towns. That's why this type of structure in partnership with the Healy Driscoll administration and their team, and obviously our federal delegation. I think that's why you need all aspects of this to be able to be positioned to maximize the amount of funding there, because that way we're able to get the most and really try to hit every single corner of the Commonwealth. So respectfully, I understand the concern over something that may still need to be developed, but I'll say our communities are on pursuing it, they're positioned on their need. They know the needs, right? We can talk about, I didn't even mention Proposition 2.5, right? So to understand that the cities and towns are under very difficult fiscal situations is something I know you know well and have certainly heard from us. But I think it reflects with this type of funding, with the type of support, with both RPAs in partnership with the state, that will actually maximize us, and that'll make sure that every single city and town can have at least the ability to be positioned on it. I think that's why this is a unique situation that requires this type of infrastructure. But I appreciate it.
And thank you, Rep. Paulino, for the reminder. Just because something's on sale at the mall doesn't mean we should buy it, right? Those of us with kids, we have that conversation in my house a lot, most recently on Sunday. Thank you so much. Any other questions from committee members? Excellent.
Thank you
so
all.
much again.
Appreciate it.
Our last person, unless one of you emailed me and the spam filter got it before it got to me, is from A Better City, Tom Ryan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the members of the committee. My name is Tom Ryan. I am a senior advisor at A Better City. We are a business organization that focuses on transportation, energy, and infrastructure issues, primarily in Greater Boston, but also for the whole Commonwealth. I'm here to testify because this bill is a really big deal. And I'm very grateful for the committee having this hearing today and for the governor for putting this forward, because it will help ensure Massachusetts can take advantage of the federal infrastructure grants that can improve our transportation system, address climate challenges, and improve our economy. I do want to emphasize that as we're dealing with the federal government legislation, many parts of the bipartisan infrastructure bill are sometimes called the IIJA, which is really unfortunate.
Rolls off the tongue.
Exactly. So the bipartisan infrastructure bill is structured for competitive grants. So it is a nationwide competition. And this bill will help Massachusetts in our ability to win these competitive grants. The bipartisan infrastructure bill is a little over 2 years old. The Inflation Reduction Act is almost a year old. And these competitive grants are worth hundreds of millions of dollars to states and potentially billions of dollars. And we can see from the first year how Massachusetts, we have some data on how Massachusetts is doing with the bipartisan infrastructure bill and competitive grants. And primarily look at something called the mega grant program, the mega projects, the big ones. Massachusetts would apply for something like the Cape Cod Bridges or I-90 Alston multimodal project. And the Department of Transportation looked at the application and said, MassDOT, quote, does not have one or more stable, dependable sources of non-federal funding and financing to construct, operate, and maintain this project, or cover any cost increases. So they look at our application and say, Massachusetts doesn't have the match. We get deducted points, money goes to other states. This bill would help change that. And this bill is worth hundreds of millions of dollars to Massachusetts. We now know, things have changed a little bit in the last year. This was from year one in the application, and under the governor's leadership and through Quentin Palfrey and his team, Massachusetts did win a big $372 million award for the Cape Cod Bridges just a couple of weeks ago. Credit to them. This bill will help for the applications that are going on through the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bill grants that are ongoing for the next couple of years. My final point is I do want to say that the administration deserves credit because it helped pursuing the big awards, but also for the municipal awards. It's hard to apply for these projects. And so I give the governor a lot of credit for dedicating funds for municipalities to help generate better applications that will lead to new investments and show Massachusetts is ready to partner with the Biden-Harris administration on infrastructure projects that can benefit the region for decades to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Any questions? Excellent.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Again, I wanted to thank everyone for taking the time today to come to testify on this bill. A reminder, if you have thoughts that come to you later in the day that you wish you would have said, please shoot us a quick email. If in the days ahead you have concrete suggestions on ways any of the language could be strengthened, please also send that along. Special thank you to my vice chair, to the larger committee for so many of you showing up today on a Tuesday morning, to my staff for doing all the behind-the-scenes work and putting together, again, the most detailed briefing book I have ever seen. And to members of the committee, if I know MTF, Mass Taxpayers, really wanted to be here. Pages 29 through 46, the analysis is so helpful, especially Rep. Smollett in breaking down the projections of how do we get this $17.5 billion number. If it's not on your bedside table, put it there and definitely be in touch if you have any questions. Again, so grateful to everyone, and with that, I will officially end our hearing.